Hello, welcome to the Van Abbe Museum. Great that you're all here despite the bad weather. My name is Olga Mink, I'm the director of Baltan Laboratories, and I'm very proud to present you two speakers today. Jalila Essaïdi is a bioartist from Eindhoven, and she's also the founder of BioArt Laboratories here. And she will present her successful project, Bulletproof Skin. And she will also sign and sell her book at the end of her talk at the exit, which is here, not the same door. So the books will be sold through this door, and that's also the exit. And so she will sign the books, and there will be a €10 discount just for today. So get your copy, I would say. We'll start this afternoon with David Rothenberg. He's an eco-philosopher and also a musician from New York. And he also teaches at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And he gave a beautiful concert last night. And I'm very happy he's here, and he's going to present you the book Survival of the Beautiful. There will be opportunity to ask questions after each talk, so please go ahead and enjoy.
Thanks, Olga, for inviting us. And it's a great museum here and a great opportunity to connect these two stories. I think they kind of connect. We'll find out. Today I'm going to talk about this book I wrote about art, science, and evolution, Survival of the Beautiful. And it basically begins with the peacock's tail, which Charles Darwin said really made him sick. And the reason he said that is because the peacock's tail is very difficult to explain within Darwin's theory of natural selection, with the survival of the fittest. That the traits that animals evolve make them fit and are useful in survival in the world. And this crazy, excessive plumage, this giant tail just spreading out, does not seem very useful. It's a huge weight to carry around. It's like it makes a mockery of decoration on a bird, to have this giant display. What was this all about? And because of the peacock's tail, it set Darwin on this whole quest to explain such things in nature, not just peacock's tails, but birds of paradise. This is the blue bird of paradise. This is the red bird of paradise. And these creatures live in New Guinea. When they were brought back to Europe, scientists and naturalists and hat makers who needed feathers said, these must have come from paradise. You must have been somewhere so amazing it could barely be on Earth. And for the makers of hats, this is a good reason to exterminate all these birds and decorate hats with plumage. And for Darwin, it was really an example of how evolution really had to be more than survival of the fittest. If you had birds looking like this, what is the use of this swirly, tiny feather? It's just so crazy. And it really points the view that evolution is also about survival of the beautiful, survival of the weird, the crazy, the extreme. This is also going on in nature. It's not the same process. And what interests me most about this, actually, most of my work on these topics has involved music and the music in nature. I've written about birds and music and whales, singing whales and music, and now insects and how all these animals have a musical side and have a whole aesthetic interest in sound. But actually, that's a lot more obscure than the visual. There's much more written about the visual beauty in the world of animals. But what interested me most is when I ran across this while I was studying songs of lyrebirds in Australia. I came across this pile of blue plastic garbage in the wilderness, and I couldn't believe anyone would have dumped all this stuff as far away as we were from civilization. And my guide who was bringing me out there, he just laughed and said, "Haven't you ever seen a bowerbird's bower? Have you never seen the bower of a satin bowerbird?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "This is an artwork made by a bird." And I really didn't believe that, but it's true. Sometimes you hear about bowerbirds' creations and they're mistakenly described as nests because that sounds very practical. But the bowerbird does not nest inside this structure. Here he is, satin bowerbird, very common bird in Australia. He builds this structure and he decorates it with blue stuff. Whoops. Wireless noise. Secret cell phones in the room. Anyway, I hope that wasn't webcast, that noisy. It's moving. If I put it back here, does it stop? Maybe not. Anyway, so the satin bowerbird, which is a very common bird, does this in people's backyards in Australia. I've seen it. And they must decorate this structure with blue stuff. Imagine they probably didn't evolve millions of years ago to need to use blue plastic bottle caps and straws. They must have used blue flowers and blue rocks or whatever else they could find. But now there's a lot more blue plastic stuff, so they may have an easier time. And what interests me so much about this is these bowerbirds, there's about 12 species of them. They're one of the very few animals we know that have evolved the need to make visual art. They need to make artworks to survive. Now the males are doing this to attract the attention of females. The females come and they assess whether the artwork is good enough. Like going to an artist studio, I suppose. Are you impressed by the artworks? Now both human males and females might both do that. But for some reason, in the animal world, it's more often the males are driven to all this extreme, unnecessary, frivolous activity. Here is the female satin bowerbird. Inside this bower, which is like a little seat for observing the performance, and the male bowerbird not only has built this thing, but he dances, he does a whole performance, he sings, he runs around, puts on a whole display. He's really a performance artist, in addition to being a visual artist. And, you know, there's a lot more performance art in the animal world than there is visual art. There's all kinds of animals doing all manner of dancing and displays and such. But actually building artworks, I would say bowerbirds are among the very few species that do that. They build something that seems so obviously, you know, not such a practical activity. If you were going to design a species, you wouldn't tend to design the need to do something like that. Now, generally, if you read what scientists have to say about satin bowerbird activity, they usually say the bird with the biggest bower, with the most blue stuff outside it, with the loudest display, the biggest showing off thing, this is the one that gets the most attention, and he's the one who gets to mate with all the females. However, that was sort of just assumed by mostly older male scientists who were studying this thing, that bigger, louder is better. And there's one woman who was in the lab of Gerald Borgia, who's the main bowerbird scientist in America. And she said, I don't think that's how it works at all. You know, I think that females have a more sophisticated sense of aesthetics than just wanting biggest, most, loudest. And so her professor Borgia said, well, how are you going to test that? And she said, easy, I'll just invent a fembot bowerbird, a female bowerbird, remote-controlled robot object, and I will mess around with her and see if I can affect the male behavior by making her flinch when something she had observed in the actual females, that when the display got too big and too loud, that they would go away or they would lose interest. It's like, you know, someone playing a guitar solo that's too loud, everyone leaves the room. And so she was able to demonstrate that the female bowerbirds actually prefer a more balanced performance, a kind of middle path of loudness and subtlety. And through this experiment, we advanced our human sense of figuring out the aesthetics of this bird species, which is something rarely done in science. Usually tends to assume most, biggest, loudest gets more attention. Peacock's tail, biggest one gets the attention. Well, why is it the biggest? It's more likely to be the best. And she demonstrated that with this fembot bowerbird project. So other bowerbird species make far more elaborate structures. This is the Vogelkopf's bowerbird. It builds this huge thing. Like, can you believe that a bird actually builds this for the sole purpose of attracting a mate? That it's not useful, they don't hide in there, they don't sleep in there, they just build it as an artwork. And this happens only in New Guinea. is where this species lives. And you wonder, why hasn't this evolved elsewhere in the world? It's most likely it has to do with the fact there are no indigenous predators in Australia and New Guinea. So these animals over millions of years can sort of entertain and evolve their most excessive and risky kinds of display that put them out there like this. If there were any predators, they would know that these bowerbirds just hang around their studios, just making art all the time, easy to pick off. This is why there are so few artists in crime novels, because they're so easy to find. So be careful. Anyway, so this is one Vogelkopf's bower. Here's another one from the Solomon Islands. So one might assume this is a more advanced bird with more stuff, but maybe not. Maybe this is the better one. Nobody has studied so specifically what aesthetic attributes the most popular Vogelkopf's bowers have. Here's the different types made by different species. And you can see McGregor's bowerbird makes this kind of a Christmas tree-like thing, and they decorate the ends with little pieces of caterpillar shit. So it is said. And apparently they don't need to learn to make these. These are genetically encoded, the kind of artwork they need to make. They just know in their brains. And presumably the females also know what we do not know, what the best one is, what is the most desirable type. So you see there's quite a variety of possible structures. And each structure is not really specialized for a particular use. Like it could easily have been something else. They don't need to make this kind of shape as far as we know. And to me that's very important, that it suggests that the functional explanation for this, like this is what the males do to attract females, says almost nothing about the phenomenon. You don't learn so much about its whole aesthetic nature by just looking at what it's for. There's more going on in nature than that. Here's how these species might be related to each other on an evolutionary tree. And you'll see there isn't that much, similarity in one type of structure evolving into something else. There's a certain arbitrariness that's there, which is part of Darwin's theory of sexual selection. Anything could be selected for if the females just happen to like it and prefer it enough and enough and enough. In general, these things are tempered against the practicality of natural selection, but in some species, it just gets totally out of hand. Here's a spotted bowerbird, decorates its bower with white stuff, not blue. And this is not a bower at all, but a sculpture made by Patrick Doherty, an American artist, who builds giant things that you could say are a little bit like imaginary bowerbird creations. And why am I talking about this here? Because I'm very interested in the ways in which the changing aesthetic of human art might enable us to see more art in nature than previous. Because there's so many art installations that look like bowerbird structures like this or this, which you could see in a museum now, and they're valued as art, at least by some people. Then when we see the work of these bird artists, then we have to take them more seriously as artworks, just because of our changing sense of aesthetics. We have to look at it and say, this is worth taking seriously. So coming back to this Peacock's Tail, which keeps returning as something that was really troubling Charles Darwin, and I think continues to trouble evolutionary biologists to this day, who are torn between whether to agree with the theory of sexual selection that suggests this is aesthetic preference run amok, run totally crazy, or is it some useful thing? Is it really indicating something useful that we just can't quite figure out? There's a tension in those theories in biology that still goes on. And I got interested in this from looking at, is this really arbitrary? Could it be anything? Or does the arrangement of these particular patterns connect the extremity of sexual selection gone crazy along with a sense of certain kind of patterns that are possible in nature and others might be impossible? And this is a visual example widely known. But for me, I got first interested in this when looking at the parallels between two very extreme kinds of animal songs, also just performed by the male bird and the male humpback whale, nightingale and whale. These songs have a very similar kind of structure that I'm going to play for you at the end. Why? They're both extreme outliers in the realm of what can have evolved. They're both very musical performances, much more excessive and much more very hard to believe. Like a nightingale can sing for hours on a tree, a humpback whale can sing for up to 24 hours. We don't know why these whales are doing this. Only the males are doing it. So we assume it's to attract females, but no human's ever seen a female whale show any interest in this behavior at all. 40 years we've been studying it. Never has a female whale approached a singing male whale. So maybe it's about something else. With nightingales, we know that it does attract females and it does defend territories. And the males do compete with song, but we don't know why this bird needed to evolve that. It did not. It just happened to go that way. And yet the structure of these things is somehow similar, which I'll demonstrate at the end of this talk. And that suggests another aspect of how biology and evolution has been interested in aesthetics, which is the idea of basic senses of form, pattern, and beauty throughout nature. Here's an artwork I saw. Someone else picked up on this idea that nightingales and whales have something to do with each other. So they painted this on a wall, and they had some headphones where you could listen to the sound of both things overlapping. This is in a British exhibit of art inspired by birds. The Ghost of Gone Birds, it was called. It was last year. So Ernst Haeckel was a famous student of Darwin who also was a kind of scientific artist who really believed that the theory of evolution required visual stimulation to get people to respond to it and to get science to really advance. So he traveled to the world and collected things from all over the world, all levels of objects from nature, showing how they were connected in senses of form, pattern, and symmetry. This looks like a geodesic dome, but actually, long before Buckminster Fuller, Haeckel drew very meticulously a tiny microscopic creature called radiolarian that live in the sea. He got these brought back by explorers in the Arctic, and he said, look at all this pattern and beauty and symmetry that's right there in nature, that people are ignoring and not taking seriously. And he put together all these books sensing the pattern and beauty, different levels of the natural world. One of them is called Art Forms in Nature. It was one of the first color coffee table books. It's always been in print. It's always been popular. And these, again, are microscopic sea creatures, more radiolaria and diatoms. And they became the inspiration for a whole aesthetic movement in the early 20th century. These florid, flowing shapes in chandeliers and lamps and sculptures and architecture. And this book was widely read and a real inspiration for artists all the way up to today. I'd say scientists take Haeckel less seriously at this point because he famously got carried away with connecting ideas of form and development too much together. And so some of his science has been more discredited. And in general, evolutionary biology is afraid of people who believe there's too much purpose and form and design to all of nature. They prefer an idea of randomness. Here is a page on the left from a scientific text of Haeckel's, and on the right from Art Forms in Nature. So you have radiolaria on the left. He loved these tiny sea creatures, which by and large people do not study because of their form and because of their beauty. And the right, this kind of ornate design of seaweed. And here, this particular arrangement of radiolaria became the inspiration for this big gate that René Binet built in 1907 in Paris when they had a world exposition there. And I think we should look at this as today we look at futuristic architecture, like, gooey Frank Gehry buildings or the swirly cinema museum in Amsterdam. Like, this was seen as the future. It looks sort of traditional to us now, but this was a really futuristic building from 100 years ago. And lots of artists in that period were inspired by Haeckel's very symmetrical things and went in their own way. Here's one of the most surrealist of Haeckel illustrations, which is like octopus tentacles abstracted into something else. This is more abstract than most of his imagery. And Max Ernst liked this gooey side of Haeckel, and even though this is a different kind of work, he said Haeckel was very much a source of inspiration. Victor Horta, and I think this is in Belgium, that he was an interior designer, architect, and he used some of these things in this whole aesthetic inside some famous buildings. And Giacomo Balla made this painting, kind of abstracting from Haeckel's symmetry, some other direction. And here's a contemporary 3D printer representation of a kind of fractal, a version of Mandelbrot set into this 3D structure. And I'm sure Haeckel would have loved such technology if he had it and would be churning these things out. And we'd be making 3D diatoms and radiolaria, one after another. So this sense of symmetry and beauty in nature is something that a lot of people have pointed out is an important part of whatever aesthetics you might find in the natural world. And in a way, it works cross purposes to the idea that sexual selection, Darwin talked about, that it could be anything. Anything could get out of hand and could be selected for. Usually, it's tempered by natural selection, survival of the fittest. So you have most birds and creatures would be they look like they're efficiently evolved to fit into their environments. Maybe they have some decoration, like a little bit of red, a little bit of blue on them, but not something so excessive. And yet, if you look at the peacock's tail, you see certain senses of pattern and symmetry suggesting this is anything but arbitrary. Like it's one particular choice out of certain possibilities that are available. And this, you look throughout nature at different levels, you'll see pattern and symmetry and color. It doesn't matter what these things are, but they have certain elements like those circular whorls in the peacock's tail. And so this aspect of beauty in nature and in life is something also mostly ignored by biology for some reason. You could say, why? Well, soon I'll tell you one reason. Sexual selection was not considered a very useful thing to study from the 19th century, early 20th century. It's only through advances in genetics that it now seems like it might be useful. But even so, the idea of trying to figure out aesthetics in different species seems rather out of the loop for most scientists. And when I was working on this book, I really was interested. It seemed to me that it should be a more important thing for science. And I found one scientist, Richard Prum, who's professor of ecology and ornithology at Yale University. He has been working on this whole research into aesthetics and biology for some time now. And he did it because he felt like the mainstream of biology was just not looking at these questions, not taking them seriously. For example, he built on some mathematics of Alan Turing about what kind of patterns are possible, turning off the pigments between one cell and the adjacent cells on the basis of activation diffusion mathematics, which I won't claim to understand, and even Prum said he doesn't understand it, but it explains why leopards and tigers have certain kind of spots and stripes and not others. And now that we have enough genetics from the work done, say, by Sean Carroll, who figured out how the DNA in one cell of a butterfly can determine what the patterns on its wings would be, Prum decided, let's figure out what all the possible feather patterns could possibly be based on these mathematical ways in which pigment is turned on and off. And he discovered there's only 9 basic feather patterns that all feathers fit into. All the other ones are impossible mathematically. And so all bird feathers are supposed to be one of these kinds of patterns, more or less, of the kind of feather that where the pigment is developed over a continuous area. So these are some examples. And this is like a summary of this research that led these guys, this team, to figure out for the first time exactly what color a dinosaur really was. And from the DNA extracted in one cell of a dinosaur fossil, they were able to determine that this one Chinese dinosaur, a lot of them had feathers, they were like birds, looked like this Enchiornis, and this is a widely publicized discovery. Although we've seen many colored dinosaurs in books and films, for 100 or more years, until now they've basically all been made up, because you could say we don't know. But now there's just the beginnings, we're able to now find this information out, even though none of the feathers have survived. Here's the Ralph Steadman version, which is also in the same exhibit, the feathered dinosaur, looking at us from prehistory. So Richard Prum goes further than just figuring out the aesthetics of, the actual possible feathers and what's possible, what's impossible, to really be the one scientist who thinks Marcel Duchamp is important, not for the history of art, but also for the history of aesthetics in science. And he was very intrigued by Arthur Danto's article from 1964. It was a philosopher of art, an art critic, called The Art World, in which Dante was seeking to explain why so many people think this work of art by Marcel Duchamp called Fountain was so important when it was just, a urinal tipped on its side and stuck in an art show 100 years ago from 1913. What's the big deal with this, That can't really be art if it's just some common object stuck in there. And Danto says what's important is not just what the object is, but what people say about it, and that there's a whole evolved discourse of people who talk about whether or not this is art, whether or not it's significant, and that the evolution of the artwork only happens with the evolution of what he calls art world, one word. And he doesn't mean the art world, which means all those crazy people who care about stuff like this, but the fact that the work evolves together with its appreciation. And then Prum said, aha, that's exactly what happens in nature. That's why there is a peacock's tail. The interesting part of the peacock's tail is not just the tail, but what goes on in the minds, what goes on in the brains of the female peacocks, the peahens who don't have that tail, but they have the aesthetic sense. They know what they like. And what matters is that the trait only will evolve together with its appreciation. Without its appreciation, it doesn't matter. And without the evolution of the sense of appreciation, he would not call something beautiful in nature art if it's not appreciated. But he really thinks this is how we can understand this better. And he wants to bring a more sense of aesthetics and the philosophy of art into biology. Many of his colleagues disagree and think that he's totally crazy. And it's more popular to look at the peacock's tail as some secret indicator of real quality and health and fitness, suggesting that the peacock's tail is like some sort of handicap you have to carry around. If you can carry around this heavy, useless weight and display it sometimes, then it means you really have good genes and you're really fit and you're the one to mate with. That's what you'll read about in most biology textbooks. But Prum says, why should we believe that? They're just making that up. We have no evidence for that. Why can't we take the trait more seriously and say that what it evolves together with its appreciation? And a beautiful peacock's tail is about just that. It's about having a beautiful peacock's tail. And but looking at this Duchamp picture, I'm reminded on this experiment that Richard Prum did on how hard it is for ducks to mate between duck penises and strangely shaped duck vaginas. This experiment, which is on the wall outside his office, pretty much looks like a Duchamp artwork or some strange conceptual art project. So this got me thinking a whole other theme. In what ways can art and thinking about art really help science? How do these things overlap? So that's kind of where the book and this presentation is moving towards. Now, at the same time, if you go back in history, this idea that peacocks' tails were about sexual selection and display was not very popular. And Darwin had a lot of resistance to this notion that nature could be so full of frivolity as evolving things like this. And a lot of people in that time period didn't like the idea of females having such a say and having such weight, having evolved this aesthetic sense that in a way was more important than the trait itself. It sort of made the display depend on female response, like the fembot Bowerbird indicates. So there was a whole movement started by artists who wanted to change science. And this is a famous painting, well, at least famous to me. I don't think it's that famous, but it's a painting called Peacock in the Woods, trying to illustrate that even the garish, gaudy peacock, everything about its coloration is all for the purpose of camouflage. So this is a didactic painting, which is in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art in Washington. It comes from a book, Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom, by artist Abbott Thayer and his son Gerald Thayer. It's like a 550-page, heavily illustrated book, which you can download for free online, because it comes from 1907. You can see all these pictures. These guys wanted to argue that the sexual selection stuff, beauty, Darwin, and Haeckel, that's all beside the point. Every color of every animal is for camouflage. Pink flamingos perfectly evolved to be invisible at dawn and dusk. And, this, was not generally taken so seriously by scientists, although it was admired as a crazy, giant project. And even Teddy Roosevelt, the president, said, yeah, This is the kind of crazy thing only an artist would come up with. But this is my favorite of the paintings, the wood duck. This one is fairly convincing, actually, that the wood duck, the most beautiful of native North American ducks, very, very bright and shiny, actually is also very hard to see against a pond in summer. And it's true that they are both beautiful and invisible at the same time. Interesting paradox. But what's very interesting about this, even though scientists were not so impressed by this camouflage theory, in a way this book was the invention of camouflage. This book made camouflage much more serious for the military. And strangely enough, the Navy, people working in the Navy before World War I, they read this book and they said, great, we're going to paint our ships like this. And so in World War I, they painted warships in these bright, crazy colors, believing that Thayer's ideas were right, that you would confuse the enemy if you had bright, disruptively painted ships that would be very hard to spot. And so in World War I, there were ships like this that, strangely enough, the idea is that something like this works as camouflage because you can't quite see how big the ship is, where it's going. It confuses you. You don't know what you're looking at, and you want to confuse the enemy. So these artists trying to explain how nature worked end up inventing camouflage. And these are World War I camouflage shots. And there was a whole popular literature in camouflage. Really would surprise you. I'm going quickly through this so we don't run out of time. These days, this project still goes on. People study the most amazing camouflage creatures are squid, because squid can turn on and off their camouflage. If they want to blend in, they can. If they want to stand out and psych out their enemies, they can. And these are experiments done in Woods Hole with these small squid. How can they match themselves to different backgrounds? They do pretty well on different kinds of sand, so you can't see the squid. On checkerboards, this is more like squid abuse, but you can still see they do all right. But what they also can do is turn. This is a more sophisticated squid, more different. They're called chromatophores, the color receptive cells. And then they can also turn on this weird light display, like sort of animated spaceships or video game characters, which has led Jaron Lanier to say that the real first examples of virtual reality are cephalopods, are squid, because they change their shape, they change their color, not just for disguise, but to communicate with each other, saying things we can barely even imagine. So he says they're the first examples of virtual reality. And this is from the guy who invented the phrase virtual reality. So the squid kind of confuse our ideas of whether camouflage is useful or an aesthetic tool to change your color at will. So a lot of artists worked in World War I. They knew about camouflage. Thomas Hart Benton was one. He did paintings mostly like this, but later he became famous for writing a series of articles on how to be an abstract painter, even though he really wasn't one himself. And these are in the Arts Journal from the beginning of the 20th century. And he had a lot of famous students, including Jackson Pollock. And these two guys are very different kinds of artists. They remained friends their whole lifetime. And Pollock was very interested in camouflage. He was sometimes interested in hiding his name inside of works. And he was intrigued by what abstract color and pattern had to do with actual things in nature and hiding things, moving on to be like the example of the most crazy, wild, abstract, expressionist kind of artist. And what interested me in the later part of this book is how this kind of thinking leads to, we see the world a different way. Like if we accept something like this as a work of art, an aesthetically organized thing, you can then go out to nature and you can see different things as being beautiful. And just a quick search revealed a whole series of a lot of photographers who post their photos online and say, this reminds me of Jackson Pollock. That from looking at artworks like this, we had artists saying, look at this photograph of lichen. Or all these pictures are put up by amateur photographers saying, this is like Jackson Pollock. I'm not saying it's all that much like Jackson Pollock, but the existence of this artwork leads us to see nature aesthetically in a different way. And we have artists very inspired by evolution after World War II, Ad Reinhardt made a whole evolutionary tree of all the different schools of thought in art. This is a famous illustration. He did this twice in his life, kind of the way scientists, starting with Ernst Haeckel, show how all life is connected in this way. These days we have scientific visualizers like Brad Paley trying to make sense of how different sciences are related, and the whole idea of the tree metaphor seems to blow apart. And this is a crazy kind of abstract picture of how different kinds of science are related. It's so dense, you can barely even see it, you know, all the things he's trying to say, but it's a pretty cool visualization of how confusing things might be today. And then what got me interested is okay, so art can change the way we see the world. Can it change the way we actually do science? I think the spider silk story we're going to hear next is kind of an example of ways an artist can work with new scientific ideas and do things the scientists didn't think were possible. I'm just going to give you a few other examples like that. And Kenneth Snelson was a sculptor at Black Mountain College in the 1940s, and he invented tensegrity, when you can hold rigid objects together with wires and hold them up in space. And his teacher, Buckminster Fuller, picked up on this and really evolved it into something that's now a very practical way buildings are designed. And so the teacher learned from the students. Kenneth Snelson's still alive, and so I got his permission to tell the story that way, where he's the big hero. He said that was all right. You can write about me if that's what you say. Otherwise, he doesn't like it when people misrepresent his importance to this technique, which now architects like Norman Foster, who studied with Buckminster Fuller, are building giant structures, airports all over the world using the kind of technique an artist invented for aesthetic purposes. The chemist Jane Richardson also had some artistic training. Was trying to figure out how to fold proteins, and you know, the science of the proteins didn't tell you how they would fit together, but just by doodling and drawing and playing around, she was able to figure out some protein folding problems that without some visual creativity nobody could solve. And today this problem goes on as we have ever more proteins we're trying to figure out. And now it's a collaborative, crowdsourced computer game called Fold It, where you can go online and try and fold the proteins and solve the problems that scientists can't figure out by just sort of playing around with the whole aesthetic sense of how these proteins fit together. And now there are several examples of protein folding online games you can play to help figure this stuff out. There's some artists who live in Amsterdam. These two Russians, Evelina Domnich and Dmitry Gelfand. They were intrigued by the phenomenon known as sonoluminescence, where you play, if you have a solution of a chemical solution with certain properties and play certain sounds to the solution, it'll start to glow in strange ways. And when they heard about this, they said, oh, we want to make an artwork that illustrates this. And the chemist said, you know, it doesn't really work that well. You can't really see the glow. It's so faint. It's really more theoretical interest. They said, no, we want to make it work. And they figured it out. And so they made several artworks where you go into this darkened room, you hear this sound, you have this solution, it's all glowing in strange patterns. And they really helped these chemists realize this phenomenon could be made visible. If you really wanted to make it visible, the scientists were more interested in making it useful, and they weren't sure what could be useful about this. But these two artists wanted to see it. And just the desire to see made the possibility come up. And you know, on their own, the scientists were not sufficiently interested in the aesthetic moment of seeing this to make this happen. In art in America, there was an ad for a dinosaur for sale, starting bids at 1.5 million euros. And it's kind of a scientific artifact. We know Damien Hirst is putting sharks in formaldehyde. Sometimes the very works of art and science start to blur. And so in the arc of the story, the book kind of like ends with the whole end part I'm not talking about. It's kind of goes on talking in particular artists who kind of combine the aesthetics of someone who's looking for basic patterns and form in nature, like Haeckel, together with the arbitrary sense of possibility that sexual selection suggests. But nevertheless, I think that the relationship between art and science is getting more sophisticated, although I still think there's a basic difference in the goals of each enterprise. An artist can make one beautiful thing revealing this glow, and it's going to be a wonderful moment to experience it. The scientist is going to want to take this as data and test for something, and it's in a way much harder. It can be more boring, but it's a lot harder, and the criteria for truth are more precise, what they are. In art, you can just produce this wonderful moment to change the way we think or see the world. Scientists has to connect enough data to be sure that's what's going on. So to end here, I'm going to play you an example of what this whale and nightingale songs have to do with each other. And we're going to look at a sonogram that prints the frequency against time as it moves. You hear a bit of a humpback whale song, and transposed up and sped up so it sounds like a bit of a bird song. Then the bird appears, and then it gets slowed down. So you can hear this kind of overlapping similarity, sensing that there's some kind of perhaps parallel of possible forms and order in these very different kinds of songs performed by animals not at all related to one another. Okay, now the whale song is sped up. And now the nightingale comes in. The slowed down nightingale into whale territory. It's not exactly the same, but it's structurally kind of related. And now you hear them all together and think about it. All right, thank you.
Hey, hello, I'm Jalila Essaïdi. I'm an artist who works in the field of bioart. Bioart is using materials and inspiration out of biology and especially biotechnology. And I really love that field because it looks at nature and the beautiful materials nature offers. And my latest fascination is with spider silk and bees, of course. I also keep bees. And like the spider web you see now, it evolved over millions of years through trial and error to become a beautiful and very strong material. So strong to catch the impact of a fast-flying beam. Well, with this spider silk, I worked on project 2.6 gram, 329 meter per second. And this is also known as the bulletproof skin. And to make the bulletproof skin, I used some ingredients. I made use of spider silk because it's biodegradable and biocompatible with the human body. It's a green material, it's a better heat conductor than copper, and it is a material that's 10 times as strong as steel. But when we talk about stronger, or strong as steel, what are we talking about? When we talk about spider silk as a strong material, then we are talking about the combination of material properties. In the case of spider silk dragline, it's the combination of tensile strength and extensibility. And the combination of those make it a very strong material. Here you see a comparison between Kevlar and spider silk dragline. The dragline is the outer main line of the web. You can see it as the scaffold where the spider builds the other lines on. A spider can make many threads, but this dragline is the strongest. And as you can see, spider silk has toughness, it had tensile strength, but it's also very flexible. And Kevlar has it less. Kevlar is a material normally used in bulletproof vests. You have like 33 layers of Kevlar and a ceramic plate in a bulletproof vest. Here you see spider silk under the microscope. It looks like a nano spring or an accordion. And the more pressure you put on it, the closer we get till the point till it springs. But spider silk can have a lot. Well, the next ingredient for bulletproof skin was, of course, human skin. This is waste of plastic surgery. And what I did, I took skin cells out of there. Started with fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are the cells in your dermis. And like you see, they look a bit like a spider web. The next type of cells were keratinocytes. That are the cells in your epidermis. Well, together with the spider silk, the skin cells, fibroblasts, and keratinocytes grown to a full thickness model. A full thickness model is at the moment a skin model that comes the closest to our own skin. And the next thing was test this skin. So I took the models, the skin models, to the Dutch Forensic Institute, and we shot at them with .22 long rifle caliber bullets. And we were lucky because that year they just got a brand new high-speed camera, so there were made some images. Well, this first skin is a pig skin because a pig skin comes the closest to human skin, and as you can see, the bullet gets just right through it. The second skin is an in vitro human skin, so the dermis and the epidermis. This third skin is an in vitro human skin with silk from the normal silk mat. And as you can see, the bullet gets also right through. And this is the actual bulletproof skin, so with 4 layers of spider silk and the human skin cells. And as you can see, the bullet gets wrapped in, but you have still a heavy impact on your bones and organs if this was your actual skin. This was a bullet on half reduced speed. And this is bulletproof skin, 4 layers with human skin on full speed. And as you can see, it goes right through. The idea is to think about how far will we go to feel really safe, because you can put yourself in a box and cement yourself in. You would be safe like that. Or take a bulletproof skin. The cultural context of spider silk. The first stories we find of Aristotle in Democritus. They are the first persons who made writing and studied spiders. And there is also a writing about how we as humans learn to weave from the spider. And we inspire our fishing nets and hunting nets on the way spiders weave their webs. But we find it also in stories like in the new clothes of the emperor, where the clothes are compared with spider silk. They feel light and smooth as if you are wearing nothing. But also in myths, the story about Arachne and Athena. Arachne, a mortal who could weave beautiful carpets and textiles. And Athena, a goddess of crafts, who was jealous on Arachne and went into a battle with Arachne, who could make the most beautiful tapestry. So Arachne made an image of all the gods, but with all their faults. And Athena made a tapestry with the gods on their best. And Athena got mad on Arachne, so Arachne got scared and tried to hang herself. But Athena felt sorry for Arachne, so she transformed her in a spider on a little silken thread. And maybe that's the reason why spider silk is unobtainable for us. We tried to harvest spider silk. In the 18th and 19th century, we find spider farms in France, where they made little machines to harvest spider silk from the golden orb weaver. But the problem with these spiders is that they're cannibalistic and territorial, so you can't keep a lot of spiders in a little place. But today we live in an age of biotechnology, of synthetic biology, a time where we can make synthetic spider silk. And in 2001 we find the first patent where they made an E. coli bacteria that can produce spider silk. And to play with the genetic level, the molecular level of spider silk is like playing with Lego. It are all loose building blocks where you can choose the right properties you want for your material. The blocks are beta blocks. You can arrange a lot of beta blocks with little beta spheres and make a really tough spider silk. Or you can think, I want a more biodegradable spider silk, and you bring in less beta blocks. Well, for the project 2.6 gram, 329 meters per second, I worked with synthetic spider silk. This is spider silk created by genetically modified organisms, in this case goats and silkworms. I worked with Randy Lewis from the Utah State University, and his research is to create genetically modified goats, alfalfa bacteria. And these goats carry the silk-producing gene in their genome, so they produce spider silk in the milk. And of course you have the silkworms, they produce spider silk in the cocoon. And the beauty of those animals, those transgenic animals, is that you can make use of an existing industry, like the silk industry, the milk industry, to get those fibers and spider silk. Well, one of the reasons why we are trying to get spider silk, and a lot of it for commercial scale, is, for example, in bulletproof vests. As you can see, bulletproof vests, they exist of 33 layers of spider silk and ceramic plate. It's heavy. In this case, you need more people to get one on. And well, I read about that, and I thought, why even bother with a bulletproof vest? What if we took it one step further? What if we as humans could create a spider silk under our own skin? But with creating this bulletproof skin, questions arise, ethical questions. Can I, as an artist, work with GMOs? Can I work with human skin, human donor skin? And like the idea of bulletproof skin, can I patent it? Can you patent a part of nature? And if it's patented, can I sell this to the highest bidder? Even if the highest bidder decide to make it only available in white, so not for black people. And while we're working with human skin is state property. So why is the state having a hold on us as humans? And if we take it one step further and make transform humans on genetically level. Well, these are different topics that are explored in the book Bulletproof Skin, Exploring Boundaries by Piercing Barriers. And I'm open for questions or ideas on the ethical questions. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joost Delmar. I'm a journalist, and I wrote about the Bulletproof Skin project, Jalila's project, in a Dutch weekly magazine called Groene Amsterdammer, 2011. Later, I managed to publish an extended version of the story on an American blog called longform.org. You can find the story there, and I think the title is New Connective Tissue. What strikes me, you just asked the question people ask about this project always. What are the ethical questions? But of course it's an art project. And what fascinates me most about the project is that it's not about the extensibility of spider silk, it's also about the extensibility of art, because somebody here just asked, could a biologist have done this on his own or her own? Well, the answer is definitely no, because what Jalila did, and I think this is part of the art in the project, the artistic nature of the project, she brought people together who never even thought about cooperating. For instance, the skin crossed with the spider silk was made by a dermatologist in Leiden. And to do this properly, Jalila brought him into contact with a taxidermist working in the same institute in Leiden. They were literally 100 meters apart, but they'd never met. So it's Jalila who brought these people together and made them cooperate. And I think that's, you see that more and more in art. It's not just a manifestation, like the famous animals on formaldehyde made by Damien Hirst. It's the whole process, the way you react to it, the way he sells them, the enormous amounts of money he makes. It's all part of the artistic message, and I think I found that the really artistic and most fascinating nature of this project. That's also the main thing in my story. It's not about, well, of course, I mean, it's a very fascinating project from a biology standpoint as well, but I think that's the true artistic nature of it. That's what I want to say. Thank you.